If that's all right with you. I don't speak Spanish, not as well as Kathy does, so I'm going to speak in English today. Sorry for all the Spanish people here. I did learn some Spanish in school, but you really don't want to hear me speak Spanish. It's not good. So let's stick to English. All right, so I'm here to tell you about the Drupal 8 Entity API. I'll start talking a little bit about myself or introducing myself quickly. I am a Drupal developer at the German Drupal agency Erdfisch. In the Drupal world, I am, is that like big enough? Yeah, I guess. I am the maintainer of the Libraries API module for Drupal 7, and for Drupal 8, I maintain the configuration translation module, which we'll see some screenshots of later. And also the shortcut module, which you might know from Drupal 7 as well. So enough about me. Let's talk about the Entity API in Drupal 8. And I wanted to give, or I want to start with putting it a little bit in context, like why we're talking about the Entity API, why the Entity API for Drupal 8 is such a big thing, or where this whole thing is coming from. So I basically want to take a look at the history of the Entity API in Drupal. And if we start with Drupal 6, there's no such thing as entities. So yeah, in Drupal 6, everything was about nodes, if you remember back in the day. Yeah, in Drupal 6, everything was about nodes. We had CCK, so you could put like image fields on your nodes and link fields and text fields, but it was all about nodes. And while that worked fine, we quickly realized that we did actually want to have fields on taxonomy terms. You know, maybe you want, instead of just displaying the text or the title of your taxonomy term, maybe you want to display a little picture. Well, you couldn't do that because you couldn't put an image field on a taxonomy term. And so, I'm sorry. I'm seeing that one of my slides got lost. Let me just check really quickly. Where did you go? Sorry, that's embarrassing, but fixable. I rearranged some of my slides last minute, and that didn't go so well. Okay, here we go, back. Right, so in Drupal 7, no such thing as entities. So as I said, we wanted to have fields on more than just nodes. So in Drupal 6, no entities. So in Drupal 7, we introduced a whole new thing that was called Field API. And at the beginning, so really, it was really about fields. So there was a hook called, in the beginning it was called hook field attach info. So you can see it was really about things that can have fields, so things that you can attach fields to. And so those were, let me see if this works. Yeah, so command and node and everything. Files you actually couldn't attach fields to, but taxonomy terms and users. And so in the end, we realized that it's not just about attaching fields to stuff. There's also a little bit more we want to do with these things. So we renamed the hook from hook field attach info to hook entity info. And that was really sort of the birth moment of entities in Drupal. Entities in Drupal, but you can see it was really a lot about fields and attaching fields to things. And that was, so the field API, as you probably know if you've worked with Drupal 7, was a huge step for Drupal, for content management in Drupal. It was a huge step. But there were also some problems with it, which we noticed over the lifetime of Drupal 7. So one big problem that Drupal 7 developers, again, like I'm a Drupal 7 developer as well at my Drupal agency, and I find this problematic very often when I work with Drupal 7. I don't know if you have the same problem. But in Drupal 7, we still have this very clear distinction between what's called properties and fields. So the node title is sort of this base property of nodes. Every node has a title, and if you want to access the node title and you have a node object, you just use the title property and it's a string directly. And then there's this other world, which is the fields, the field API, which I just talked about. For instance, the default body field, which is on nodes. If you want to get the actual node body value, you can't just do node body because that's an array. You have to do the language none zero thing, which is sort of annoying. Yeah, and so that's a problem, that we have these sort of two worlds, and they really don't work together well. What you can also see is that, so in the body field, we have this array for each language. So we have a value for each language. And for title, we just have the string. So here already, you can see that the node title in Drupal 7 is not translatable. And that's a huge problem, because obviously if you have a multilingual site, you obviously need to translate your node titles. I mean, that's, but you couldn't in Drupal core. And as you also probably might know, there was a whole module dedicated to just fixing that for this one field. And it was not like a 3-line module. It was a pretty heavy module just to fix that one thing for one field. So it's very clear that this is really not how we want it to be. We want to really be able to translate a node title without doing all this work. Another problem was code duplication. So with the introduction of entities in Drupal 7, we tried to consolidate a lot of the code, a lot of the identical code for the different entity types, so we don't have to write the same code over and over again. But we didn't get very far for Drupal 7. So in Drupal 7, it's basically just loading of entities that is generic. So there's this entity load function in Drupal 7, and that works for any entity type, which is nice. But there are a lot of things that are not generic. So all of these functions in Drupal 7, comment save, node save, and so forth, they're not just like simple, really small wrappers. They're like the actual saving. Like they have the actual database queries that save entities. And so that's a problem in terms of, both in terms of maintenance, but also, like if I want to have a new entity type on my custom site because I don't want to use nodes and I have this special use case, but I want to use an entity and I want to create a new entity type, I need to write another one of those save functions. I need to write another 100 lines of code with a database insert or database update, depending on if it's existing, blah, 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 blah. I need to do all this work, which already has been done like 6 times already in core. So again, it's really clear that we need something better. All right, so much for the history. Now we're actually going to talk about the Drupal 8 Entity API. So I showed you some problems we have with Drupal 7. Now we're going to try to look at the solution and hope that Drupal 8 does bring some of the solutions. Now Drupal 7 already does have somewhat of a solution for these, or for some of these problems in the Entity API module. So yeah, you can install that, and it solves a lot of these problems, but it's still built, obviously, on Drupal 7. It's a Drupal 7 module. And so for Drupal 8, the idea was basically put this module in core, but not just move it over, but basically rebuild it on top of the new Drupal 8 concepts. And so that was basically what we did. So the first step, if you've used the Entity API module in Contrib, you'll know that entities are classes. So entities are turned into classed objects. So that was basically the first step that we did for Drupal 8 Entity API. So you now have a node class. It's not just a standard class. It's so each node is now an instance of this node class, which also implements an interface. And you have methods that you can work with. So yeah, so as is depicted here. You can get the ID of a node or the UUID, because in Drupal 8 every entity has UUID support, so you can get the UUID. And you can get the label, and you can get the bundle. So these 4 methods that I show here, the first 4, are generic methods that you can do with any entity in Drupal 8. Yeah, and you don't need to write any code to do that. It's just there for any entity type. And very importantly, as you can see on the bottom, what these classes can also do is they have a save and a delete method. So you can just, if you want to save an entity and you have an entity object, you call the save method. Couldn't be any easier. And the same for delete. Yeah, so that was basically the first step. So now we have, right, so we can save an entity, we can delete an entity. And these are all the generic methods that are for any entity type. And on top of that, as you can see at the top, there's so this is sort of the point I'm trying to make, there's an entity interface, right? Why does this not work? So there's an entity interface here. Okay, so this doesn't, there we go. Here, entity interface here. So all these methods are generic for any entity type. But there's also a node interface, and that also has specific methods just for nodes. So if you want the node title, you can also call a getTitle method. Or if you want to get the type, you can also get a getType method. So these are specific for nodes. And what's also really useful is if you want to get a node object, you can either load it using a static load method, or you can create it like from scratch. If it's not yet saved in the database, you can use the create method. And this is also generic. So if you create a new entity type, you have to create a new class, because entities are classes. But then you can inherit these 2 methods, and you don't have to do any work. So you don't need to write a custom load function or a custom creation function. You just get that for free. So that's fairly useful. All right, so that's basically, that's what you need to do to create a new entity type in Drupal 8. You need to create a class, because entities are classed objects now. So the second thing you need to do is register your entity type with Drupal. So as you can see, I copied this from core. This is the node class. As I showed before, it implements a node interface, and it also extends a content entity base class, which is a base class which gives all these useful, for instance, the load or the create method that I just showed earlier. Those are inherited from the content entity base class. Now, just a general note: if you've never seen object-oriented code, if you're just a Drupal 7 developer, or you're I don't know, you're sort of intimidated by this object-oriented code. I don't want to really go into the details of like what is an interface, why are interfaces good or why are they bad or anything. So please don't, if you're scared, don't be scared. This is not like, I don't want to, the point of this session is not to teach you object-oriented code. It's just the fact that or the move to classes and objects is sort of very fundamental in the entity system, so I can't really get around talking about it. But I don't really want to get into all the nitty-gritty details. And if there's something you don't understand, or if there's a question, obviously just ask at any point. Okay, so this part up here is what in Drupal 8 we call an annotation, and it's actually not specific to the entity system. It's all around Drupal core. It's actually how plugins in general work in Drupal 8. Right, but so what we need to do is not very complex. We say, okay, I have a node class. It's not just any class, it's an entity type. Why it says content entity type, I'll explain in a minute. But I'm an entity type, I have an ID, and I have a label. And if we do just this, so if we create a class and put this little comment thing up here, we've created a new entity type. And this entity type can be loaded, can be saved, can be deleted. Everything I just showed you with like, I don't know how many, 10 lines of code, 15 lines of code, or whatever. So that's really cool. This annotation is actually a little bit more complex, so I cheated a little bit. In Drupal core actual, there's like a bunch of more stuff here, and I'll show you some of that in a minute, but that's not important right now. And this, in theory, this would really be sufficient, actually. Okay, so that was sort of the first thing that we did with Drupal 8 entities. So now we have entities that are classed objects. Obviously, we're not done here. But the next thing that happened was actually sort of coincidental and no one actually planned it that way. But there was a different initiative in Drupal 8, the configuration management initiative, that was completely separate from the entity system or the entity initiative. They had nothing to do. They did like the nice config export, import, YAML, and everything very nice. And then at some point they realized that, so they decided very early on that things like node types or views, which we now have in core, or image styles, they are definitely configuration. So they basically fell under the big hat of the configuration management initiative. And when they decided what are we going to do with node types? So when they thought about this, they realized that these node types, they have an ID, like a machine name. And you can have multiple of these node types on each side. And you want to be able to load a node type, you want to be able to save a node type, you want to be able to delete it and everything. So in English, there's a saying, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck or it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. So basically what we realized, these config objects like node types, they can be loaded like entities, they can be saved like entities, deleted like entities. So really, they're entities. So we really didn't realize it at the first, but when someone basically proposed it at some point, it was like, yeah, obviously we should turn these config objects into proper entities. And so that's what we did. So we now have this whole new category of entities in Drupal 8, which no one would have called entities in Drupal 7, but now they are entities in Drupal 8, like node types, views, image styles, and I'll show you a list in a minute. Yeah, so there's a whole new category of entities in Drupal 8, and they follow the same, because it's the same, they're all just entities, they have the same interface. You can use the exact same method. So all the methods I just showed you a second ago, they work for node types in the same way, for views and so forth. So yeah, that was really a big step, even generalizing it even more and reducing even more code duplication. Yeah, so that was really great. So just as a comparison, so this is the slide I showed earlier with the list of entity types in Drupal 7, and this is the list of entity types in Drupal 8. So we now have this distinction between content entities and configuration entities, and that's why it said content entity type earlier on the node class. And as you can see, we have a couple of even content. So everything in this block is what we would have considered entities in Drupal 7. So we have all the usual suspect. Content here is actually node. That's sort of a confusing thing. But we have our file, we have our user, we have our taxonomy term. I don't know if you noticed, but vocabulary was actually an entity in Drupal 7. That moved over to configuration in Drupal 8. And we also have a couple new content entities in Drupal 8. So the aggregator stuff was converted to proper entities. Contact messages are entities, which is interesting because they're not actually saved to the database. So when you put in a contact message, it just sends out an email, but it still is a regular entity, and you can do all the stuff with it as well. We have a custom block entity now, so you can create custom block types and put fields on them, which is really nice. Menu links are also entities. Menu links are not fieldable, at least not with Drupal core. Yeah, but you can, here it's basically the same, the same analogy. You can load in Drupal 7 already. You can load menu links. You can create them. You can edit them, whatever. So conceptually, they're definitely entities. And now in Drupal 8, we've actually made them proper entities. Right. So those are all the content entities. And in addition, we have this huge list of configuration entities, which, again, no one would have called entities in Drupal 7, but we sort of now need to get used to this new terminology. And yeah, so we have content types here, we have views here, we have all sorts of different things which are not like, I don't know, tour, whatever, migration, okay. But, so you have all the things that you would expect. Image style should be somewhere here, yeah, over here, date format, so all the things you would expect. So those are also now entities in Drupal core. And one further note is that there's really only these two categories. So there's not so far any entity that's not a configuration entity nor a content entity. So you can either, you have to be either one and you can't be anything else. There's no third way. So far, I mean, in theory, someone could write a module in contrib that does something completely different. Yeah, but in Drupal core so far, there's only these two things. So that's also important to know that if you have an entity, it's either one or the other. Okay, so this talk is also going to now go into some of the details of both of these both of these entity types. So we're going to talk a little bit about configuration entities. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about content entities, because content entities are a little bit more interesting and have a little bit more cool stuff. But before that, I want to quickly talk a little bit about things that are generic for both of these entity types. So there's a couple of things that actually applies to both configuration entities and content entities. So we already saw all these methods you have, like ID and UUID. So those work for both entity types, but there's a little bit more. So I said earlier that in Drupal 8, one of the things we did, we basically moved the contributed entity API module into core. And as I said, the first step was converting entities into classes, and the second step was introducing this concept of handlers. And this is also basically stolen from the entity API in Drupal 7. In Drupal 7, it's called controllers, but it's the same thing, it's just a different word. And so the idea here is basically that you have all these sort of things or concepts that are related to entities. So you have storage, you need to store an entity, you have access handling and so forth, you have forms. And while having entities as classes is nice, you don't want to put all these different things into one class. Like, you don't want to have a class that is like a form and a storage and an access control and something else. So the idea is basically to split these different things out into different classes. So each class is responsible for one thing. And the benefit is also that these classes can then be reused. So for instance, now you see here that the node class actually, so this is actually completely copied from the node class in core. I ripped out a couple lines, but only because it didn't fit at the bottom. So you see that the node actually overrides the storage handler, but that's a very specific use case. In general, there's a generic storage handler for entities that you can use, and it just works out of the box. And the same goes for a lot of these other handlers. So by using this concept of handlers, we actually can greatly reduce code duplication and greatly increase reusability of these entity concepts. Yeah. So I want to, right. So the question is now, I showed you earlier how to create an entity object by using the load or create methods So now we have all these different objects. So like for each entity type, I have like these 10 different objects now. So how do I create those? And for this, Drupal 8 introduces a so-called entity manager. So the entity manager is basically your one-stop shop to get anything you want that's related to entities. And among other things, the entity manager has these useful little methods for getting all these handlers. So if you now want to do something with the storage of a node, and we'll see what you can do with the storage in a minute, but let's just say you want a storage handler for nodes, you just tell the entity manager, give me the storage for nodes. And if you want to do something with access, you tell it, give me the access control handler for nodes. And this concept is actually extendable, so there's a generic getHandler method, which is interesting insofar as that contrib can now introduce additional handler types. So if, for instance, rules in contrib or search API or some other generic module wants an additional entity handler, they can just basically provide it, and then people can use this generic, getHandler method, and everything still works. So that's kind of neat. Right, so now that we have the storage, so we have the entity manager, we can use that to get our storage object. So now I want to show you what we can do with the storage as one example of these handlers, because we can actually do what we did earlier. This is the slide from before, the creating and loading in a little bit cooler way with the storage. Because the storage itself has this create and load method. So that's actually, this would actually be so this method works as well. But this one using the storage object, this one using the storage object would actually be the preferred way of creating or loading an entity in Drupal 8. And as you can see, there's not, fairly easy to understand. The storage can create, it can load, it can also save. This isn't shown on the slide, but it has a save method in the same way that receives an entity parameter. Yeah, so this is just sort of an example of one of the handlers. So far, any questions at all? Okay. Right, so there's another thing. So we're still sort of in the domain of things that apply to both content and configuration entities, because handlers, both configuration and content entities, can have handlers. So far, so good. There's another thing that applies to both types, and that is the entity query. If you've worked a little bit with Drupal 7, you will know this as entity field query. This is now just called entity query, but it's the same thing. But it was improved a little bit in Drupal 8, because if you've worked with it in Drupal 7, it was sort of not very intuitive to work with, both in terms of the actual usage. You had different methods for all sorts of things, and in Drupal 7 it actually returned like this weird array structure keyed by entity type and everything. So I don't know if you can relate to that at all, but in Drupal 8 this is a much nicer API, because it's actually almost identical to the database query engine. So if you've written like database queries with db select in Drupal 7, you already know the entity query API, because it's the exact same API as can be seen here. The only difference is that it doesn't actually return a database result object, but it just directly returns the IDs that matched your query. So yeah, so with this little snippet, you can, in this example, I query all the nodes that start with the word about in their title, and they were created after this weird random timestamp. And then I load them, and it's very easy, very convenient. And because we're not querying the database directly, we're using this entity query abstraction layer. This actually works beautifully if you've installed Drupal on MongoDB. So there's a MongoDB entity query backend. Why, thank you, sir. Yeah, so there's an entity query Mongo backend. So if you just install Drupal on Mongo, have your nodes stored in Mongo, this will just work. You don't need to change anything. So that's kind of neat. And yeah, so I just said earlier that the preferred way to use the load method is actually to use a storage object. So now I'm basically going to show you the same thing using the storage, and it's the same code basically, because the storage actually has a get query method which I can use to get this entity query object, and yeah, it's very self-explanatory and very easy to use actually. Okay. So that was sort of the part about things that are generic for all kinds of entities. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about configuration entities, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about content entities. So the one thing I want to talk about with configuration entities is translation, because as we saw earlier in Drupal 7, entities are not fully translatable. So you can translate the fields, like the body field had this language key thing, but title, as I showed, is not translatable. So the really interesting or really important thing is now how do we translate these entities? And for configuration, that's easy because the configuration management initiative, independently of the entity system, they basically solve this problem for themselves because you can translate any configuration. And because these configuration entities are just configuration also, we just basically get the translation for free. So I'm just showing you here, this is a screenshot of the configuration translation module in core, and you can use it to translate a node type in this, for this example. And this is actually fairly useful because the node type description is sometimes actually shown to the, if you go to like /add or node add, you see like a list of content types, and you definitely want to translate that to different languages if you have editors or something that create content. So, and that was a non-trivial problem to solve in Drupal 7, and it's very, very easy now because of configuration translation. Another example, just really quickly, is this is an extraction of a views translation form. So as you can see, there's like a billion layers of nesting here. So these are all like field sets. But what you see here is the pager configuration for a view. So in views, you can enter like the text for your pager, and you can actually translate that with all in this form. So it's very, very easy. It works. It's very generic. Yeah, so this is a very, very powerful, the configuration translation system is, that's built into core is very powerful, and it just basically solves this out of the box. So this is from the UI. If you actually want to work with configuration entities in the API and want to work with translations there, you don't need to do anything because the configuration system is set up in a way that as soon as you load configuration, it checks the current language, and it basically loads the correct version of the configuration. I'm not going to go into detail how it does that because this is about entity. This talk is about entities and not about configuration. But I just wanted to show this, that you basically don't need to do anything. You just call the generic. Yeah. So this code here gets the node type storage. It loads the node type. This is basically what we've seen before, and then it just calls. So node type has a get description method, which we call, and we get the description. And because of the config system, because the config system is so smart, we get it in the right language depending on which site we're on. And so this is the get description method is node type specific. There's also a generic get method, which you can use for all config entity types. And again, this will just work with translation out of the box. Nothing to do there. Okay, so configuration entities are, oh, only 10 minutes? That's bad. Okay, so now I need to hurry up. Okay, but now we're basically done with configuration entities. Those translation is solved for them. And there's really not much more to say about them, but there's a lot to say about content entities. So especially regarding translation, and especially regarding the problem that I showed earlier, the difference between properties and fields. So how does that work in Drupal 8 now? So in Drupal 8, we've actually managed to make everything an entity has a field. So there is no such thing as the distinction between properties and fields that we had in Drupal 7 is now basically irrelevant. There's no such thing as a property anymore because everything is a field. So the node title is in fact a field. And just with that, we can actually translate it. So this is a screenshot of the content translation module in core. As you can see, I'm here creating a German translation of a node. So this is a node, and it has a title field, it has a body field. This is just, everything just works out of the box, and because it works because everything is a field. So this was a huge step for Drupal 8, and it's really, really awesome. Another awesome thing is not just translation that just works out of the box, but you now actually get to use widgets and formatters for stuff like the node title. So it says manage form display up here. This is actually what you would see under manage fields in Drupal 7. We've split that up a little bit. I'll come to that in a minute. But now, as you see, I can actually use a different widget for my node title if I want to on the node form, which is really, really awesome. And the same with formatters as well. So I want to go into a little bit of detail, a little bit more about these fields. So we have a bunch of different field types in core. So each of these fields is an instance of a field type. So image is a different type as title and so forth. So each field is an instance of a field type. And we have a bunch of field types. These are all the ones in core. Now, I don't want to go into all of them, but for instance, title would be string. It's just a string, no text format or anything. So you can again use the entity manager to get a list of fields for a specific entity type and bundle. So this gives me a list of fields, or to be precise, actually field definitions. And these are again objects, and I can get the type. So as you can see here, the node title is a string, the default body field is a so-called text long, and the image field that in the standard profile is an image. It is an image type field or whatever. So right, but you can again use the entity manager and to get all the information you need. So how does this information get into the system? So each entity type can declare its fields in a specific method. So this method is on the entity class. So this is in the node class that we saw earlier. There's actually a base field definitions class, base field definitions method, and it returns a list of field definitions. And so here you can see that the title field is created as a string field. So this is sort of where the field type comes into play. And then it has all these useful methods for setting a label, setting some metadata. As you can see here, you can actually set on a per field basis which fields should be translatable and which shouldn't. So because you might have some image field which is the same image across all translations, so you don't want to have that translatable. But you could also make that translatable by setting set translatable to true. So this is a very flexible but also very easy to use, especially if you have an IDE with auto-completion. This just basically flows right to you. There's a couple other things you can do with this field definition. So here's an example. I'm creating a gallery class, a gallery entity, and I want an images field, but I want to have multiple images in my gallery. So what I do is I just set the so-called cardinality. This is a fancy word, but it basically just means the amount of things I want to have. And in this particular case, I could put like a 1 here or a 2 or whatever, but in this particular case, I want to have unlimited And this would trigger in the UI, this would trigger the add another item that you probably know from Drupal 7 Field API. And everything just works out of the box. These field definitions can also have settings. So similar to the field settings in Drupal 7, you can, for instance, say that images should be stored as private files in this particular case. Yeah, so there's a lot of things you can do here. Yeah, okay. And again, this is the list of field types. This is a screenshot or an extracted screenshot of the add field form in Drupal 8. So this is sort of correspondent to this list, except that some of these values or some of these field types are not available from the UI, just because there's no real use case. But as you can see, there's a lot of goodies here in terms of field types in contrast to Drupal 7. So we actually have entity reference fields in core now. A bunch of commonly used entity types are already listed here, but the most important part is this other thing where you can actually reference like any entity type you want, and this includes the configuration entities. So this huge list we saw earlier, you can actually use as an entity reference field. Comments are now a field, so you can now have comments on users, or taxonomy terms. You can even have multiple comment fields on the same bundle. So if you want to have like private comments for administrators, but then like, you know, to say like, oh, Kathy is really nice and Peñasquito is really dumb. You don't want everyone to read this, and then but you also maybe want to have public comments, so you can do that. Yeah. So email field, link field in core, very nice. And so the important part, so this is basically the contrast to the slide, to like the properties versus fields slide I showed earlier with the language none and everything. So this is how you actually get entity values in Drupal 8. So as I showed earlier, many entity types have these utility methods you can just use out of the box. But these are obviously not generic. So this is a node-specific method. But the bottom two are generic for all entity types. So you can just use a get method with a field name, or you can also access it as a property directly. This is sort of a black magic we're doing in the background, but this is basically the same thing. But because this is sort of similar to Drupal 7, we support this as well. So you can just use node title value. So that is the difference to Drupal 7. In Drupal 7, it would be just node title. In Drupal 8, you actually need to type node title value. That's a little bit unfortunate, but for all the things you get out of that, I think it's a good trade-off. And also do a little bit more. So you can also get, for instance, if you have a tags field and there's multiple of them, you can also use this tags property or pretended property as an array, like this or like this, but you can also use methods for that as well. So either way you want, if you want to be like all OO and want to use only methods, that's fine, but if you want to do like the Drupal 7 style, that's also fine. You just need to remember there's one more level at the end in contrast to Drupal 7. Okay, so let me see, since I only have, yeah, okay, let's do that. So that then, yeah, so now, basically as the last thing, I'll show you how to do, how to actually work with translations of content entities in the code. So we've seen that you can just use the content translation interface module to create translations from the UI. But if you want to do that from the code, so which one is this? Yeah, this one, okay. If you want to use entity translations from code, it's also very, very easy. Each entity has a getTranslation method. And the fancy thing about this getTranslation method is that this translation is again a node object. So we started with a node object, which I show, which I prove to you by using the getTitle method. And then I call a getTranslation. This is really sort of annoying. I call a getTranslation method on it, and I get an object back, but this is again a node object, so I can again call getTitle. So this is really, really useful. You don't need to you basically just need to decide which language you're working in once, and then just work with it as a regular entity. And in most cases, like 98% of the time, you don't even need to do this, because Drupal will already figure out, like, based on the current language, which language you want. So it'll already give you basically this translation thing. So to make that point more clear, I did the same slide again, and you can actually call this, you can actually do this as well. You can basically assign this translation to the node variable, and it's the same thing. It is the same thing. It is a node, and it's the same node. Yeah, so there's a lot more that the Drupal 8 Entity API has in store. What I didn't talk about, for instance, at all was like REST stuff, validation stuff. That's really, really fancy. Views integration, forums. Yeah, there's a lot of like all these different. Let me go back to the handlers. Yeah, all these different handlers that we have in core. As you can see, forms can be generically done for entities. Even routes can be provided generically. Access handling is generic. Views integration is generic. So all these things the entity system does for you out of the box. Yeah, but I guess then, since my time is up, I basically stop now. And if you have any questions regarding anything more specific, maybe we can go into detail about one of those things. Yeah, but then I'll switch to the very last slide and just say thank you for your attention. Oops, that was too much. Whatever. Yeah, so are there any questions? Again, we can go into some of the stuff I didn't talk about, into if you're interested about like REST stuff or about entity forums, widgets, whatever, we can go into that, or?
In Drupal 7, no content entity that supports revisions are nodes.
Very good question. So I'll repeat the question. The question was that in Drupal 7 only nodes support revisions. And very good point. Sorry that I forgot to mention that. That is actually completely generic as well in Drupal 8. So both translatability and revisionability are very generic. So all you need to do basically in blah, 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 blah. There. All you need to do is just set a translatable flag in your annotation, and everything will just work out of the box for translatability. And then you also need to do the set translatable on the field definitions, which I showed earlier. And for revisions, there's a similar flag. It's, yeah, basically there's a revisionable flag. It's not called that, but it's kind of weird. But there's just a simple flag that you need to set. And as soon as you do that, everything will just work out of the box. So these entities have, for instance, a set new revision method. That's really useful. So from the code, you can either say, if you just do entity save, it saves the previous entity without a new revision. But if you do entity set new revision, like one single call, it creates a new revision. And it does all of that automatically. One thing I also didn't get to talk about, which I sort of had in the slides that I skipped now, was that the database schema is also auto-generated for all entity types. So basically you can't get anything wrong anymore because you don't write. So in Drupal 7, a lot of the contrib modules didn't get revisionability right, or they didn't do it at all because it was like super tedious to write all the schema. And that's just solved out of the box. So you basically really just need that one flag, revisionable true. And then you also need to specify which fields should be revisionable, and then you're done. So that's really, really cool. Sadly, what didn't get done is the whole UI. So the Node module has like this UI for reverting revisions and everything, and showing the list. That sadly is not generic, so that you would basically have to do on your own for a custom entity type. But since the views integration is generic, you can just basically create a view of revisions of your entity type, so that actually shouldn't be that hard. Yeah.
So what happens when you change these base properties or whatever between releases to the scale?
So the question was, what happens to the schema if I change the base properties? So there's also a schema update manager in core. So basically, when you install a module, like for instance, when Node module is installed, the Drupal realizes, okay, here's a new entity type, so let me go and install all the tables for nodes, so people can save nodes. What it also does is it saves like the current state of all the field definitions and basically backs them up. And so now when you go into the code and you change something, like for instance, you want to make an additional field translatable. Like maybe some contrib module forgot the set translatable flag, and you need this field translatable on your site. So you go into an alter hook, you do set translatable. Now your thing is translatable, but your schema is still old. So what you do is you hit update PHP, and update PHP will be nice enough to realize that, oh, so these field definitions changed, so let me go and update the schema. I actually have a little screenshot showing that. Here. So that's what, I'm not in presentation mode, so that doesn't make sense. There. So that's what update PHP would tell you in that case. So it would realize, okay, so the node entity type changed. Do you want to update it? Click yes, and it's done. So what doesn't work is, so this doesn't yet do any data migrations. So if you already have nodes in the database, and then you need to like alter a column or something, you would basically need to create a new table and then migrate all the data over and everything. That is not yet done. So this only does things that you can just do like that. So creating tables or adding columns and stuff like that. But still very useful.
It's the time for the coffee break. We have to go to the building in front of the home. If anyone has more questions, you can talk with Tobias in the coffee break.
Yeah. And I'm all here tomorrow as well, so.